All right. Let's kick it off. This is the second edition of the Modern RiptideLab Podcast, diving into all things Cube with Dom Harvey. We got some good feedback from our first one. I mean, it was limited feedback. We're still kicking this off, but somebody on YouTube said this was the best conversation on Cube design I have ever heard by far. So, question for you: do you have an alternate account named Sebastian?
I don't, but I feel I'm under more pressure now, or maybe less, because either we're going to excel ourselves and reach even loftier heights, or we've already peaked, and the only way is down from here.
Yeah, I mean you can't be the best every time, and probably a lot of people who watched did not share his opinion, but who cares about that? There was an interesting poll on Twitter this past week about what percentage of all cubes do you think are in the mold of the MTGO Vintage Cube, meaning playing the best cards in each slot, allowing for some interpretation of what best means. And I would extend kind of their definition to include, say, pauper and peasant cubes, modern border cubes, any type of cube that sets some card pool and then runs the best cards there.
Yeah, it's interesting to know where you draw the line there, because I think basically any cube, by definition, sets its own parameters and then tries its best to work within those parameters. And even cubes that don't explicitly do that, that in itself is a statement of ideology about what you want your cube to look like, and what goals you have, what conditions you're working under. So taking the more narrow problem of what percentage of cubes are going to try and emulate consciously or unconsciously the Magic Online cubes, the vintage and legacy cubes. That's a really interesting question to me. It feels like the kind of thing which you would be asked in a consulting interview, right? Just to see how you kind of think about the problem and how you would possibly get to an answer on that. I think the answer is going to be pretty high, honestly. And
Give me a number.
I would say in the region of, 60%. But it's because I think for a lot of people, that's how they first became acquainted with Cube, and how they, outside of their own cubes, how they mostly experience Cube. It's especially if you live in an area where you don't have a big local play group, you don't have a bunch of people that you can wrangle into a Cube draft. The way you experience Cube is going to be you go on Magic Online, and whenever Vintage Cube is up for the week and you draft it. So I think for a lot of people, even if you're trying to come into it with an open mind, that of course is going to define how you see the format and how you approach building your own cube. And I've been surprised how many people I've seen say, I am building a carbon copy exact replica of the Modo Vintage Cube. What's the best place to print off 700 proxies or whatever, right?
Yeah, I think
like,
that was a
that
thread on the MTG Cube Reddit this week. It's interesting you say a consulting interview question. I kind of interpreted it as like a Family Feud question, where you try to guess like what the population would say is the most common response, and I put it in the 50 to 70% category, which coincides with what you said as 60%. And I think an interesting thing about like when you play a low power cube or kind of like a unconventional cube is that for me it's a lot of mental overload to kind of read all the cards. Like if you play a pretty traditional cube, they're going to run a lot of historically famous cards that you would have seen in Constructed. And so it's easier for someone who's followed Constructed Magic a lot to kind of dive in there and then mentally parse like what the cards in the pack are without actually having to read 15 different cards. And so I think in a way, this broad kind of high level approach to cube design is what's going to be most accessible.
Yeah, you have this weird evolution of complexity in Magic's design, where at the start you had a lot of accidental complexity, you could say, where if you read Animate Dead, for instance, that's a card which as printed, you hand someone a copy of an alpha Animate Dead, and they are not going to understand what it does. Basically, it's gonna be a struggle to interpret that just from the text itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then, even though that card has been reprinted several times and it's had several like Oracle updates and so on, it is still completely impenetrable. So even with modern templating and all the best rules minds in the game working on that, they still have not found a way to make that easily understood. I do think that card is more grokkable than it is readable, if that makes sense. Where if you ask me to explain verbally in 10 seconds, what does this card do? Well, it comes in, it animates a creature, and if one goes away, the other goes away. Like that's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of converting that into Magic legalese, that's a lot easier said than done. And
what do you think the designer of this card was thinking when they gave it -1 power? Is this some...
Well, so that in itself is a curious question. But then you have Dance of the Dead, which is basically an exact copy of the card, except it gives it +1/+1, and you have to pay 1 and a black to untap it in every untap step. So you have like the median version of that effect, which is Necromancy, I guess. But that also has so Necromancy is perhaps the simplest, but it also has the additional flash thing where you can play it as an instant. But if you do, Necromancy gets sacrificed at the end of the turn, which means the creature it reanimated gets sacrificed at the end of the turn in turn. And so that led to the now completely devoid substance mechanic being introduced as a way to, in theory, make that clause more easily understood. Completely failed in that goal, by the way. And now substance is one of those relics of the rules, one of those oddities where I think there's a passage in the comprehensive rules which literally says substance. This is an ability that does not exist anymore and has no effect, just for the sake of historical completeness. So we have, I guess, until Diabolic Servitude, which kind of did a similar thing, but also has its own twist to it. There has never been a version of that effect that just is straightforward and makes sense. And that is, like I said, an extreme example, but a good illustration of what design used to be. And I think that is a form of accidental complexity. I don't think when they made that card, they were thinking, we can afford to make this game as complicated as humanly possible, especially as when that set was being made, the very first Magic set, you're trying to introduce this product to a new audience who they're not enfranchised players yet, because enfranchised players can't exist. There are no Magic cards at this point. You have to, in theory, make things as simple as you can. But nowadays, it feels like things are going heavily in the opposite direction, where there is intentional complexity. And Card Time is a great example of this, where there are several cards, and Cosima, your girl Cosima, is chief among these, where these are double-face cards, so already breaking a precedent that was set for many, many years in the game. Yeah. And either side of the card is more wordy than the average card in any set from 5 or 10 years ago. So it's like more than doubling the average.
Well, I looked at Dance of the Dead, and that is indeed a huge number of words on a single Magic card. I feel like every time I play a cube and I see that very small font, I just don't want to look at it. Hold on a second. Somebody is telling me that my stream information is all wrong because I played Loop Hero last night. Let me update that, and I will edit this when...
There's a Loop Hero inside all of us, I guess.
Have you played the game?
Yeah, I think it's... I haven't, but I've heard good things about it, so might check it out at some point. But to me, Dance of the Dead and Cosima, actually, 25 years apart, are the perfect examples of that meme where it's like, I'm not reading all that, I'm happy for you though, or sorry that happened. Like that's, like if I'm a relatively inexperienced Magic player or cube drafter, and I see that card in the pack, there are 14 other cards I've got to get around to reading at some point before this whole train of packs piles up to my left or to my right. I'm not going to read that. I'm just going to hope that it's not some busted card that I'm overlooking and just move on to other things. So
Can I ask you
That
on Cosima, do
that
you
is
think
one
it's
thing, I guess,
busted?
to be mindful of. Yeah, I don't think it's busted, actually. I think it's an interesting card. If you're looking at a Power Max cube, like a Vintage or Legacy cube, I don't know if it's even a good inclusion necessarily. I think it's fine, but I think it's not as interesting as it might need to be to justify how verbose it is, to put it mildly.
So far, whenever I've played it, it's like drawn 3 cards and come in as like a 5/7. It's just a very, I mean,
Yeah, I think it is one of the cards that gets boosted most in a double fetchland format,
mhm,
especially with the ability to put Cosima in at, or
instant
charge it
speed.
up, put it in at instant speed. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
versus in a normal cube where you have 10 fetchlands total and the cube might be way more than 360 cards, and everyone is taking fetchlands super highly, super aggressively because they have a view of how important that is if you're drafting to win, then it's going to be hard to fully maximize Cosima in that context.
Mhm.
But yeah, in a cube like yours, I think that's the perfect environment for it to flourish.
All right. So you were talking about intentional complexity, accidental complexity in the context of approaching a cube environment. Um, and the original topic before we got Riptide sidetracked was the idea of cubes being a Power Max design thing, and I'm gonna ask maybe a bold, offensive question to some. Is Power Max
Oh,
design?
hit me.
Is building a cube the Power Max way? Can you even call it design? And I'll
I
elaborate
think you
that.
can because, okay.
Well, so in the way that I perceived a lot of like the early cube design articles and proponents was that the people who were building them built them almost entirely using their player brain, meaning they treated it almost as if it was like a 360 card or 450 card whatever EDH deck that would have to compete against all the other uh, cubes of the same restriction, and that all the discussion that centered around it was simply like, is this the most powerful card relative to the other cards that we're considering? And that's a very player focused line of thinking. And as you learn Magic, get into Magic, you're not going to be a cube designer or a cube owner without being very into Magic. So you probably have years and years of thinking along this line of which is the most powerful card. And then that line of thinking is now ported into cube building with the singleton restriction kind of keeping it in check.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and not making any assumptions about how you're framing that question there, but I think, designing, or the designer perspective is not inherently uh more informed or educated or important than the player perspective. And
No.
if anything, so for example, for the Magic Online cube, the player perspective is what should count, right? It doesn't matter if the Magic Online Vintage cube offends some of my personal or design sensibilities, because it is being designed for a mass market. And
Mm.
as long as it satisfies that audience, then it is doing its job. However, however much I might raise an eyebrow at some of the choices or find some cards frustrating to play with or against, if by and large it's bringing in the dollars and getting people to log onto the platform, then I guess job well done. It has this kind of crudely capitalist logic to it. But for the if you're thinking about your own cube and your own cube group, you have this weird tension between, you are designing something which you want 7 other people, or however many you can get on a given night, to want to show up and play. So you have to think about the player perspective, but those players and that experience only exists because of the work you're doing as a designer. And it's kind of a thankless task if you're designing for a group and ignoring your own preferences and just, let's say your local cube group loves the stock vintage cube to whatever extent that exists.
Mhm.
Yeah, you could optimize for that perspective and just print off a copy of the Modo Cube at your local print shop, right? But if that's not what you personally enjoy doing, then why is it on you to go to all of the work of corralling these players and curating the cube, organizing the cube, if it's not the cube that has any personal resonance for you, right? So, and that's something which I think comes up at the micro level all the time. Is there's a card in this cube which the cube designer really has this deep attachment to, and it's never going to leave the cube, even though the drafters themselves they don't share that attachment, and maybe the card is not up to snuff in terms of power or other metrics, and so it just wheels around packs every single time. But it means something to the cube designer to have it in there wheeling around those packs, and so that's a price that everyone involved is willing to pay to get to sit around the table together.
But I find that there's always like a focus on the example you brought up of a low power card that doesn't get played, as opposed to some high power card that automatically gets played.
It can go the other way too. I mean, I've made that mistake of I have attachments to high power cards that I've had success with in other formats, largely because they are high powered cards. And so I put them in my cube and they become the best thing to do by default. And maybe that triggers an easy dopamine rush for me or whatever when I get to win with that card again. But for everyone else, the charm is lost on them, so to speak. So it can cut both ways. But I think there is a crucial difference there between good design and interesting design, and often just the short-term enjoyment of a player base. Because again, you have this chicken and the egg problem where if you have a bunch of cube drafters who are weaned on that experience of vintage cube and that's all they know, you can lean into that and give them what they have the most comfort with, and they're not going to complain, but they're also maybe not going to get to try other things or consider new perspectives. And so you present them with this high concept, very strange, abstract cube idea, and it might confuse them at first, and maybe they don't enjoy the first draft of that format as much. But if they come back and they draft it more, then maybe they appreciate that, and then your next cube experiment maybe is going to go down easier with them. So yeah, I think there is definitely a tension to be grappled with there.
Yeah, I think I sometimes like to think of things idealistically, in the sense of like, if we're trying to apply design principles and we pretend that magic doesn't exist, how would we approach this? But that's very naive when the only people who are going to be playing a cube are ones who are, in general, quite familiar with magic. And I think there's no separating the two ideas. But I know what you're saying, that for example, the penny pincher cube that we drafted last month, I found to be brilliantly designed, but I would say that I had less fun with it than other things. Like I intellectually very much appreciated all the synergies and kind of the layering that went into it, but I wasn't itching to get back to it after I finished it.
Right, and there are so many good analogies you could bring in there. Whether it's, are you a film critic who loves to dissect the kind of philosophical implications of film as high art, or do you like, as those people often like to parody mass market films, do you like the car chases and explosions and so on and so forth, right? Or one that I think will resonate with many Magic players, given how many of us seem to be involved in software in some capacity, is, you're, as a web designer or a software developer, you care very much about what's going on the back end, and you can get into these really heated sectarian discussions about which programming or scripting language is the best, which framework to use, what are the principles of good design. And the people who are using your software or looking at your website don't really care about any of that. They just want something that looks nice and is efficient and sleek and so on. And so there's this disconnect between the priorities that the two camps have, and the hope is to try and set up a process where those two camps can align in what works for them. So yeah, I mean, it is fun to play with powerful cards because that it's hard to explain that without it sounding kind of flippant or self-explanatory. Like, it is just fun to play with powerful cards a lot of the time. And for me, I've kind of soured on Vintage Cube a bit, but there is a lot of fun to just getting to play with the original Power 9, these iconic cards which would not fly under design principles in any other era of Magic. But for that brief moment in 1993, when we had no existing principles to work with, those passed the smell test somehow. And that by that happy accident, I think a lot of people got a lot of extra fun out of Magic. So I think any attempt to design an environment has to be built with that acknowledgement in mind.
Do you so I've found over the years that some people seem to be quite offended to a non-traditional approach to cube building in a way that, I mean, if we look at board games or something, there's thousands of board games out there. There's not one approach that works for everyone. And you can look at a game like, I don't know, I in college played a bunch of Munchkin with my friends, and I think that game is not well designed at all in terms of like pure game design, but that there's still fun to be had there. And I'm not going to begrudge anyone for enjoying or preferring that kind of game.
No, and so if someone enjoys something, you often hear that dictum of just let people enjoy things. But if you are a game designer, whether in a professional context or an amateur context, like most of us, then you do have to think about why that is. Why do people enjoy things? You do have to interrogate that. And so the answer in some cases is there are some games which are fun for, one playthrough or as like a quick thing at a party, but don't have much replay value. And that's the goal. That's the whole point. And if you play the game 20 times and you make the criticism that, this seems a bit repetitive or a bit shallow, well, you're kind of coming at it from the wrong angle, because it's not that you're wrong, it's that you're asking the wrong question or moving on to the wrong territory. And so you can apply that concept to a lot of the Power Max Cube discussions as well, where when someone asks what are the top 5 cards in blue-white, for example, well, what metric are we using? Are we talking about the most fun cards? Are we talking about the most powerful cards? And if you think that it's fun to play with powerful cards, and those two questions overlap quite a bit, or is it, given the constraints of my format, what are the most powerful cards? Because like, even if you design with that traditional Power Max mentality in mind, what are the top 5 blue-white cards? It's not an easy question to answer, because let's say Guides of Saint Traft would make the list if you're talking about a blue-white tempo deck, for example. Meanwhile, there might be other cards like Dragonlord Odotai, or maybe not Sphinx's Revelation anymore. I don't know where that falls in the power rankings, but you could have a very controlling but powerful blue-white card and a very tempo-focused but powerful blue-white card. And it would make sense for either of those to be on the top 5 list, but it might not make sense for them to be there together, because there's not really a type of deck that can exploit both of them well at the same time. So I feel like often that's a question that people ask to kind of get out of having to thinking about the problem any further. It's, well, okay, I'll just ask the chorus, what do we think are the best cards? And I'll just copy that list and I can move on to the next color pair, right? But even when you adopt that kind of a consensus framework, there are still further questions to answer if you want to really refine your cube format.
Do you think, so obviously there are different reasons why people play cube, and for some people it's like a break from their more serious constructed limited formats. For some people, they're always going to prefer these splashy things. For me personally, it is the basically only format of Magic I play, and I tend to be a very I'm someone who's always very interested in like esports, competitive play, that sort of thing. And so for me, it's kind of my casual competitive format where I want things to be very fair, interactive, but because I don't have any other like magic outlet for that sort of gameplay, and it's what I'm looking for. I'm wondering, is there better terminology that we need to describe cubes? Because I feel like powered unpowered only goes so far in the discussion.
So I think it's hard to find a term that does not in itself require a lot of existing knowledge or presuppositions and so on. So the best example I can think of for this is there was a cube article. It may have been on SEG, may have been somewhere else, and it got posted to the subreddit, and someone criticized it in the comments because I would have liked to see them use the Strix scale. You know, why would you not use that? And for
Yeah.
anyone who's unfamiliar, the Strix scale is this reimagining of the traditional 10-point ranking for evaluating how powerful something is. And the issue there is that, especially in a format like EDH, you ask someone, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how powerful is your deck? And it's always, every single deck under the sun is a 7 or an 8, or maybe a 6, somewhere in that range. You never hear someone say, you know, my deck is a 10, my deck is a 4. It's always kind of clustered in that like upper middle range. And you know, any professional statistician will tell you this is not an exclusive to Magic problem by any means. Yes. So you can come up with this alternative ranking system like the Strix scale, where instead of just saying it's a 7 out of 10, well, now you can call it a Strix 7. That means something. But if I don't already have this cheat sheet to tell me what does a Strix 7 mean, what does a Strix 8 mean, those terms mean less than nothing to me. Those are less useful than saying this is a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10 power level cube. So
I found out what level mine was because it was mentioned in the Reddit article of the Strix scale. And I just want to call out, we got a raid of 15 people from Epic Eki, so we now have quite an audience in the chat of people tuning into the YouTube preview of the podcast. Yeah.
But that highlights the accessibility issue, right? But someone had to tell you what your cube's ranking was on that scale, and they might be right, they might be wrong, you don't know. So it's really hard to really put much stock in that.
Yeah, I remember once upon a time there was like a cube contest. This was like maybe 5 years ago that Magic was running, and you could submit your own cube list to be like considered for being hosted on MTGO. And at the time, I was quite annoyed because it seemed like the cubes that were selected, that the main criterion was how many Twitter followers you had. And as I go further, like sometimes people message me to hey, can you look at my cube? Can you give me feedback? And that is such a difficult, inaccessible task to do, that like to just look at 360 cards and try to wrap your brain around it, or 540 cards, whatever. And one, you don't know what their motivations are. Two, you really don't know how it plays. And I'm wondering, like, if I had to, you know, describe my cube to somebody, what words am I going to use? How do I quickly broadcast that to someone in a way that will meaningly inform whether they want to play it or not?
And that's why I think maybe the best piece of cube content that I've seen recently was almost like a second order piece of cube content that was published on Cube Cobra, dealing with it was called A Primer for Cube Primers. So this is basically outlining how do you convey information about your cube in a way that people who don't know anything about it can understand and process and learn from. And I think like that article was very good in its own right, but that's the kind of thing which we all need to be thinking about more, especially, you know, because you can have a local play group who knows all of the personal quirks and complexities and so on of your cube. But if you're getting into the online cube discourse, which I would encourage people to do, then it can feel like you're talking past each other a lot of the time. And even if you say, oh, well, here's my list, and that's the perspective I'm coming from, just looking at the list doesn't always tell you everything you need to know. And that's part of the fun. Like, that's part of what makes this such an interesting design problem over time. It's that you can look at a list and you can see their personal touch on it, but that could mean so many different things, and you then get to have a further conversation with that person to kind of unlock all of that. So that's the kind of thing that I think is worth being mindful of. I don't just want to look at your cube list. I want to look at your explanation, however long, of what is going into this cube list. Like, what's the thought process? What's the mentality behind it? And that is kind of what you need to have a useful discussion in the first place, I think.
Yeah. So to jump in another direction, we had a discussion on the forums about what makes a card feel fake. And I think kind of the aesthetics and the feeling of a card can influence not just like their power level, but your kind of appreciation of them, your likelihood to include them. And the card that drove this discussion was Hallowed Spirit Keeper. And so to me, a lot of times these cards that come out through the Commander products have a quite fake feel to them. And there was another question asked in our thread looking for cube topics about what non-cube gameplay or articles influence your cube design. And for me personally, I'm very driven by, I guess, looking through fair, modern, and legacy deck lists. And if I see a card that is in one of those fair kind of aggro mid-range control decks, I'm very interested in seeing it play out in my cube and seeing the play patterns. But a card that comes in through Commander oftentimes is quite powerful in like a certain direction, but not in the way that makes it into legacy lists. And I think, Scavenging Ooze is a card that we've seen so much in Constructed over the years that it has come to feel like a real card, even though its power level is quite high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to go through those two questions in order, the flippant answer to what makes a card feel fake can just be the card stock, which these days feels very kind of phoned in, and you can get a new Magic card, and just the feel of it is so different from a card even from 5 or 6 years ago. So just firing that easy applause line out there, first of all. But I do agree that some of the cards that come in through the supplemental products, it's tough to quite know how to look at them sometimes. And Hallowed Spirit Keeper is a great example where this card, even though those commander sets are straight to Legacy, straight to Vintage, it doesn't show up in any of those formats either. You might see one Hallowed Spirit Keeper as like a tutor target from time to time in a very small subset of like green-white creature decks, for example. But that is it. That is the sole use case for that card in Constructed. And as far as I can tell, you don't see it that often in Commander either. So it's a card that just exists, and if you put it in your cube, it's incredibly powerful, and that's it. So it doesn't feel like it has any legacy or history behind it. It's hard for any card like that to feel iconic or resonant at all, because it just exists. It just manifested itself into existence, and you can cube it or you cannot cube it. And it's good that the card exists, because if you do want to cube it, it's now there for you. It is a real thing that some people will recognize. But compared to a card which was printed in a normal set 10 years ago, and first it was played in Limited and then Standard, and then maybe it made its way into Extended and Legacy and so on, there's no easy reference point for that card. So it's much harder to just understand if it's good or version from a lot of different Constructed formats. I play a lot of Constructed, and it's useful to have these formats that have all of these different rules and different card pools, because sometimes there are cards that they make a mark in standard, however big, and then as soon as they rotate out, they drop off the mat completely because no other format can really use them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that maybe is a sign of the power level of the card and what power level of cube it might fit in. But more often, it's a case of, maybe this was part of a set or block mechanic, and usually those mechanics which are kind of constrained to their own block. So some tribal mechanics are a great example of this, where there are a lot of humans, a lot of goblins, a lot of elves. There aren't as many, dinosaurs, for example, right? So you might have a dinosaur deck that works in standard, and that's great. It's never going to work in a larger format because it's not getting anything. But all of the so that being said, it can be interesting if you think dinosaurs are really cool, and maybe you have like a tribal component to your cube where there's some changelings and some flexible tribal payoffs. You might think, hey, let's see if there's a dinosaur deck that did well. And for that, you're going to look at standard, for example.
Yeah.
Or you might think, I want to kind of blend the old with the new, or if it's a very generic, broad archetype, like blue-white control, for example. Well, you can look at whatever blue-white control deck is in the most recent standard card pool, and there's always going to be one. Or you can look at blue-white miracles and legacy, for example, or blue-white stoneblade, blue-white landstill, how that's changed and evolved over time. And you can pick out elements from each of those, and you can take what you think is
you're
good,
breaking up a lot
the
in the
format-specific baggage that's going to be in any one of those deck lists. Okay, I'm back and hopefully sounding a little less robotic now.
Yeah, I think it's a bit better. Let me adjust your position on the screen. So I had in the discussion on Singleton on Reddit got quite a bit of reaction, and there was one argument that I saw in one of the posts that someone said that the cards that Wizard sees fit to make functional reprints of are safe, and cards like Lightning Bolt, which obviously you don't want maybe mono red to have 8 copies of in constructed, they feel are not safe. But I feel like there's a big distinction between what is broken in cube and what's broken in constructed. Like, I don't think Once Upon a Time, for example, is going to ruin any cube matches. If anything, it's going to make there be a lower frequency of kind of these non-games where one player just gets completely color screwed, mana screwed out of it. Can you speak a bit on kind of this, how you evaluate a card that may be banned and constructed in the context of inclusion for your cube?
Once Upon a Time, I think, is the actual, literal, perfect example to frame that discussion with. So in Cube, you often have a either completely singleton or mostly singleton, fake singleton deck with a somewhat flimsy mana base, where you maybe have a few kind of distinct sub-game plans, like maybe you have a 2-card combo in your deck, but it's not the central focus because it can't be, because it's a singleton format, right? So you have this one of and this other one of, and maybe there's some redundancy on either piece, but your deck has to be more flexible than that. And so Once Upon a Time both decreases the quantity of non-games by making sure you have that land drop, you have that 2-drop so you don't get run over, and also can help to enable some of those interesting build-around pieces that you can seed into your cube. So in that sense, I think Once Upon a Time is a fantastic card to include in your cube, and it's hard for it to be too good. And if it is, usually the issue is there's maybe one creature that's so much better than anything either player can do, and that creature is the issue. And so you cut that creature, and that's the problem. Whereas in Constructed, you have decks that are explicitly built around one thing, this one piece. And once upon a time just massively increases the consistency with which you have that piece. And so that can lead to games feeling very homogenous. And you can build around the fact that you have 4 copies of Once Upon a Time as well. So I played a lot of Amulet Titan over the years, back when it had Summer Bloom, and then since then. And Once Upon a Time was such an incredible boost to the consistency of that deck that it single-handedly made it the best deck for the time that Once Upon a Time was legal, after some of the other worst offenders like Oko had been removed. And you're never really going to get that in a cube format. So that's exactly the kind of card that increases consistency in a way that scales much more dangerously for constructed. Whereas a card like Oko, for example, is just busted in whatever format you put it in, whether it's Throne of Eldraine booster draft, whether it's any constructed format, whether it's cube. That card, just because of what it does, the effect that it has on the game, will always lead to this very just stilted gameplay. And that's a price of admission. That's the whole point of playing with Oko, or putting that in your deck, putting it in your cube. So you're not ever going to be surprised that Oko led to bad games in your format, because have you read the card? Why did you put it in the first place? Right? So that is the main difference there. To go back to that question of inspiration from constructed, one thing that I find it really helps me for is you often have these very quixotic decks that maybe are never the best thing to be doing, but they pop up, they have 1 or 2 results in one format, in one snapshot in time, that just don't, you never really see anything that does the same thing elsewhere. And so those can be a flash of inspiration for what to do in your cube. One good example, I think, is I'm writing a piece for my thread that's basically a love letter to the card Nest Invader, because I think that card is this kind of unsung hero that actually is the perfect glue card for a lot of different decks. And there was a deck that existed very briefly in Extended 10 years ago, and Modern for one tournament.
Extended, I haven't heard that term in a while.
It was basically this Windbrisk Heights Primeval Titan deck, where it was a combination of token makers and ramp spells, where you could Windbrisk Heights out a Primeval Titan or an Emrakul as early as turn 3, or you just had your 4 birds, 4 Noble Hierarch, and the spawn token from Nest Invader and Lotus Cobra. You had Knight of the Reliquary tying the whole room together. So you could either build this combo onto a land to cheat out this big thing, or you could just build up mana to cast the big thing. You could cast the turn 3, turn 4 Primeval Titan, which, let's say you have Lotus Cobra, then that gets you 2 lands, you make 2 more mana, you cast another spell. So that's a kind of deck which very rarely shows up, because you need all of these specific pieces, and you wouldn't know to think it up, you wouldn't know to imagine that deck unless you had seen it before. But the fact that it existed at one brief moment in history means if you stumble across that starts the gears turning in your head for, oh, that's kind of cool. How might I work in some elements for that into cube? And you're never going to get that exact deck, because you can't have 4 Titan, 4 Windbrisk Heights, 4 such and such.
Well, you could.
You could, sure. But maybe you have a deck where it's just a normal green-white creature deck, but you add a Windbrisk Heights, and you add a Primeval Titan, and you add a few cards that care about lands, and now in 1 out of every 4 or 5 games, that element comes up. But most of the time, you are just doing other things. You're playing a more normal creature game. So that's the kind of inspiration that I look for. I know Sam Black, who is one of the most decorated, constructed brewers, deck builders of all time. He takes a lot of inspiration from Limited, where especially for Standard, where if there's an interaction that works in a draft format, then he thinks, okay, well, how might I convert that over to constructed? So for him, there's this pipeline of this caught my eye in Limited. Let's see how this works in constructed, and then presumably, if he's building a cube, that then informs his experience in cube. So you kind of go from one extreme to the other, and then you come back to this spot somewhere in the middle. So
does Sam Black have a cube? Do you know?
He he wrote a few cube articles a while back, which were very off the ball. But so there's that. There's also singleton formats can be good for this. So EDH, for example, if you want to know how to support an artifact theme, you go to the EDH recommendation page for an artifact commander, and you see what are the cards that are most often played with this or work the best with this. Or stuff like Canadian Highlander, Singleton. There have been some really weird Singleton formats back in the day with very specific requirements where you see how people build decks under those constraints, and that can be good food for thought as well.
Yeah, I do run, to get back to what you were saying, Nest Invader in both of my cubes, and it is kind of shocking how much play you get out of that spawn token. And I've won multiple games in older iterations of my cube by turning the spawn token into a 5/5 dragon via Sarkin the Mad. And I think every game that you play, you kind of get a different look at what you can do with that token, how it affects your sequencing. And to me, it's an example of a card that is definitely not in the, say, top 10 green most powerful cube drops, but if I'm looking for a card that provides the most interesting gameplay, it's definitely up there among the green 2 drops.
Yeah, you won't ever, you're not going to first pick that card. And when we think about that kind of flexibility, there are cards like, Tyler Stracker, let's say, which are more commonly recognized as having that and being more powerful examples of that. But I think it's very hard to make a cube worse by using a slot on Nest Invader. It's a card which enables lots of different things, and just in terms of the decisions it gives to you and forces you to make, I think all of those are pretty interesting as well.
Yeah. Somebody in the thread asked, and I think this will be our last topic for the podcast, to do a kind of deep dive. We'll call it like a medium dive into an archetype. And you brought up these cards a lot at the beginning of the podcast. I want to look at Reanimator and if you should include it, why you should include it, and let's start with your take on the archetype.
I like Reanimator, and I don't know how much of that is just a lack of more appealing things to do in black outside of aggro or specific color combinations like blue-black, but I think it's an interesting thing to have, and people like chasing that dream. They want to make some big dumb animal on turn 3 or turn 4 way ahead of schedule. So
turn 2.
I like, well, sure. I like trying to support that, but then there's a question of how you do it and how far you want to lean into it. Because, if you are reanimating Iona on turn 2, for example, that is a lot different than casting, Dread Return on Grave Titan on turn 4, for example, where one of those plays will win you the game over 95% of the time. The other one is a very good play, and it's often going to lead to you winning the game. But there's more gameplay to be had after that point. It doesn't just lock it up there and then. And so if you look at the Vintage Cube, a successful reanimated deck is going to lead to those big swings. Either you do everything or you do nothing. And you have to be able to do everything because of the power level of what's going on around you. Where if someone has this amazing mono green ramp deck or the mono red aggro deck or some blue deck with all of the best blue cards from throughout Magic's history, you need your best draws to be so good that no one can compete with those. And so this arms race develops where, in order to avoid getting run over yourself, you have to run other people over, and whoever ends up running the other one over, there's not that much good gameplay involved. And those decks, for the most part, they are essentially 3-card combo decks, because you need the creature itself, you need the reanimation effect, but you also need the way to get the creature into the graveyard. And so needing to do all of that as soon as possible means you need quite narrow versions of each of those effects. So you need the best creatures, which you're never going to be hardcasting in a normal game, you need the best reanimation effects, and that includes stuff like Exhume, which you're not going to play that in a fair black mid-range deck, for example, because the symmetry is too damaging once you get to that point. But if you're in specifically Reanimator, then you kind of need that for that to work. And then you need the narrow discard effects like Putrid Imp, for example, which you just need to get that card in the bin as soon as possible. You don't really care how you do it. So to make Reanimator work in that context, you need narrow examples of 3 different classes of cards. And that is, I think, just poor cube design on the whole. And it often leads to that deck being kind of a trap in the cube that it's in. What I think is a good model for Reanimator, and something I try to emulate in my own cubes, is you're putting something good into play on turn 3 or turn 4, but it's easy-ish to answer. Maybe it leaves something behind. The game continues after that point. So it's not a core plan. You don't have a Reanimator deck, but you have a mostly functional deck that has Reanimator elements in it.
But do you find that it puts like too much constraint on, say, your... So the problem that I always run into when I try to do this is that I have a very fast, aggressive cube. So to be able to reward control, say, for example, for even being control, you'd need these very powerful 6 and 7 drops to allow them to stabilize. But I find that a lot of those cards are so powerful that they just become very binary removal checks on turn 2 or 3 when they hit the board. And I can remember playing Team Sealed in the basement of our local game shop, where you take 120 cards and you build 2 decks out of that. And I had a deck that had 20 power on the board via Reanimator on turn 3. And it was at that point that I thought, this is kind of not the direction that I want to be taking my cube. I don't feel like this is the best use of time. And so I find it difficult to know, like, how do I put strong Reanimator stuff in there while still having Grave Titan and the like as rewards for my control deck?
Yeah, I think the answer there is you look for creatures which are good at that power level when you cast them naturally on turn 5 or turn 6, but which don't run away with the game if you cheat them into play on turn 2 or turn 3. So something like Avenger of Zendikar would be a good example, right? Where if you cast that when you have 7 lands in play, it's going to do a good job at stabilizing most board positions. If you reanimate that on turn 3, you're only getting 3 tokens, and then maybe you get to pump the tokens up next turn, and then if they have a removal spell for your Avenger, you've got a few 1/2s lying around, so it's not that scary. So that's the kind of card, and Green has a lot of these actually, where they get better as the game goes on, and so there's a cap on how good they can be if you cheat them out early. Sun Titan might be a slightly worse example of this, where often if you just put that into play early on, you won't have anything good to really return with it, because especially if it's the only thing you were able to bin in your graveyard. Whereas if you cast it on turn 6, when you've traded off your 3-drop with their 3-drop, or they've had time to kill something else that you've played, and you can buy that back, then that is a more impressive play at that point, and it deserves to be. Like, that's kind of what you're shooting for. So cards like that, I would say, where it's easier said than done to find those, especially across all 5 colors, but that's the kind of thing that you want to look for there.
Yeah. I guess you mentioned that Green had a lot of them. When you said that, Multani came to mind.
Yes.
Yavimai's avatar. And I assume that this is a rather unimpressive reanimation target on turn 3 or whatever. But yeah, and I guess in your cube, you run a lot of discard as a mechanic, which would make kind of the one piece of the puzzle of Reanimator less of a parasitic design element.
Yeah, so creatures that bin themselves or are good to cast just early on and also decent to reanimate are a good way to tie that room together. So something like Seasoned Pyromancer, for example, one of my favorite card designs ever, pretty much. But in a reanimated deck, you can cast that to set up your reanimation stuff. You can bin your big creature while digging for your reanimation spell, and then also you get some trump blockers. If the Pyromancer dies, it has this ability from the graveyard. You can get some more tokens. But also, sometimes what you want to do with your turn is just reanimate a Seasoned Pyromancer. And that's not a dominating play. It's not something which your opponent slumps in their chair and wonders how they can ever win from that point. It's just a good value play to keep things moving. Or further up the curve, Waker of Waves, an uncommon from the core set last year. So this is a card that bins itself while also digging for other things. So you can kind of dig for the spell that would reanimate it. And then once you do reanimate it, it certainly has a big effect on the board, but it's not the kind of thing where, like, oh, the game is just over if the thing is unanswered. And if you do remove it, you unlock that lost power on your creatures again, versus something like Elishnorn, for example, where that comes in, it kills everything you have, and then even if you're able to remove the Elishnorn, which you have to do to keep playing, you then need to spend a lot of time rebuilding.
Sure. And you said a comment earlier about what else are you going to do in black? And I've found my cube has recently moved a lot towards self-mill and delve as kind of a way to do cheaty feeling things that isn't very parasitic, and pretty much all the self-mill cards are, almost all of them are pretty useful on their own. And there's a combo that I had in this last stream that it didn't come together, but I'm looking forward to seeing how it feels, where you have Vivian Monsters Advocate, which has this -2 that lets you kind of tutor up a creature from your deck that costs less than whatever you played. And I'm waiting for someone to break a game with that and these delve cards. And I think this kind of gives you the spirit of Reanimator, that you have these targets that, they're pretty much just vanilla bodies for the most part that come out, but you still need to set it up and kind of get different parts, being the self-mill and the delve card itself, in order to have it be an accelerated play.
Yeah, I found Eldritch Evolution is very good for that too. And that's a great example of a kind of emergent combo, if you'll excuse the pun, in Cube, where often a lot of the creatures that bring themselves back have an artificially high mana cost, or there are ways to cheat the sticker price on a creature. So, Delve being the perfect example. And so you might have a graveyard deck that wants to be casting Tasiga as early as possible, and maybe has a few other Delve creatures, but then sometimes you get to do that and then turn your thing into some 7 or 8 drop, which you could also reanimate with some of the other tools you have, but this gives you like a nice backdoor way to get that in by surprise. And that's the kind of model for a deck that has reanimation in it. To me, it's a deck that has a lot of these overlapping graveyard synergies, and that includes being able to reanimate stuff, but it's not a reanimated deck. So you might have a kind of a black-green aggro deck, for example, where you have maybe, let's say, a Wild Mongrel. There are a lot of black-green gold cards like Grimflayer, Lot Left Troll, which point you in this direction. You're applying pressure while also doing stuff with the graveyard, and so maybe you reanimate your 3-drop just to cut a mana off the cost, and that's great in an aggressive game plan because you're getting this big threat at a low cost. But also maybe your mid game plan is you have some 4-drop or 5-drop that's at the top of your curve, and if they kill that, you have a reanimation spell that can bring that back. So you have this kind of a fair reanimation sub game as opposed to this single-minded unfair reanimation main plan. Sure. And yeah, to go back to what you said to close this out, I remember years and years ago, cube content creators, insofar as that was even a thing back then, would talk about the issue with black, where it felt like black didn't have a coherent identity and wasn't that powerful. And if you looked at the black section of most Power Max vintage or legacy cubes, you would see all of the 2-power 1-drops, 8 different copies of Carnophage and Diagraph Ghoul and so on and so forth. And then you'd also have a bunch of random interactive cards sprinkled in, maybe like a Knight's Whisper or Read the Bones or something. And then also you would have 7 different reanimation cards and a bunch of big things to cheat in with then. And there was no overlap between these categories. So you would go on their spreadsheet and they would have their 60 black cards alongside their 60 red cards, but those black cards did not fit in the same deck together.
Right.
Nowadays, I think it's a lot easier to have those different categories of cards feed off each other. So I've really liked, for example, Living Death, where you can build a deck where this is your premier reanimation effect, but you could also build a sacrifice deck, which is aggressively slanted, where on turn 5, your big finish is, I sacrifice all my creatures, I cast Living Death, and now I have a massive board with all of these same effects again, and you don't anymore. Or, I play my Grass Messenger, I sacrifice that, it comes back with Undying, I sacrifice it again, and then I use my my Reanimate on it. It comes back in, I drain you, I sacrifice it again. So you build this combo finish with your own reanimation cards. And so that's the kind of stuff that I'm looking for. Is I don't think that any color these days is shallow enough that you need it to be off in its own sandbox. I think you can build these bridges between these different elements of it, and that's great. That's a fantastic position for cube designers to be in.
Yeah, very well said. And that wraps it up for today's edition of the RiptideLab podcast. Thank you all who are watching live. Thank you for those of you tuning in on YouTube. And if you have something that you want Dom and I to dive into on a future episode, be sure to let us know. Thank you.
Yeah, I do. Oh. I do actually. I think I did have a post on the forums a while back about how to tie Reanimator into other stuff. So I don't know if that's worth linking in the show notes, or
sure, definitely.
I guess you can hit me up wherever and I can point you to it. But yeah, always happy to chat to anyone about Cube. So thanks for watching, and yeah, talk to all of you again soon.
Bye.